For as long as anyone in Riha County could remember, the machache grass had been the one thing in the township nobody argued about. 517 acres of upland prairie east of Tabor Creek, running up over the Flint ledges toward Kettle Draw, grazed by the same family since 1874. Old men at the co-op elevator called it the best stand of grass on that side of the county, and every rancher who leaned on a fence rail out there agreed on exactly one thing: you don't put a match to good grass. So on a raw April morning in 1962, when 54-year-old Bozena Svejda walked out past her corrals with a drip torch her late husband had welded from a syrup can and a length of pipe, and set fire to her own east pasture, the county responded the way counties do. Somebody on the Tabor Creek party line saw the smoke by 7 o'clock. By 5:30, the volunteer fire department was rolling with both trucks. By 8, 11 men in rubber coats were standing at her fence, watching a widow in a canvas chore coat calmly walking a line of flame along her own hillside. And there was nothing on fire that she did not intend to be on fire. Lars Bielek, the fire chief, asked her what in the world she thought she was doing. Bozena said she was burning her pasture. He asked her why. She said, "Because it needs it." That was the whole conversation. The trucks went home. The story did not. Within a week it had traveled through the sale barn, the grain elevator, the Sokol Hall, and both churches, gathering opinions the way smoke gathers in a low draw. Men who hadn't spoken to Bozena Svejda since her husband's funeral suddenly had a great deal to say about her judgment, her land, and her state of mind. Had the widow finally come apart out there, alone on that place? Bozena said nothing. She ordered fence wire, kept her books, and the next spring she did it again, bigger. And in the third spring, on the ground she had burned, something started coming up out of that blackened dirt that no one in Riha County could explain. Cattle buyers noticed it before the neighbors did. Bozena didn't explain it either. She just kept striking matches, calm as ever, while the whole county wondered what she saw in that grass that none of them ever had. What did she know that everyone else had forgotten? If you've ever been laughed at for trusting something everybody else gave up on, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel and tap that like button so stories like this one keep finding the people who need them. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. Now let's find out what happened when one woman lit a fire the whole county said would ruin her. Bozena Svejda was not a woman who explained herself. In 54 years, she had built a reputation on the opposite habit. She worked, she watched, and when she finally said something, it tended to be worth the wait. Her grandfather, František Mačáček, had come out from Bohemia in 1874 with a trunk, a feather tick, and a wife who cried for 2 years, and he had claimed that upland grass when every sensible settler was fighting for creek bottom. The bottom men got their floods and their easy corn. František got flint ledges, thin black soil, and grass that stood higher than a wagon wheel in September. He never plowed more than the garden. Neither did his son Otakar, and neither did Otakar's daughter. By 1961, Bozena had been running the place alone for 3 years. Her husband Karel had died at the loading chute in February of 1958, 59 years old, gone before the truck driver could get around the trailer to him. Their son Radek had taken a steady job at the co-op elevator in town, married, sensible, and every Sunday he drove out and asked his mother when she was going to cut the herd down to something a woman could manage. She ran 73 cows and she did not cut down. What she did do, more and more in those widow years, was walk. And walking, she noticed things that did not sit right. The strip, she noticed, most ran along the north edge of the place, where the railroad had held a right-of-way since before she was born. Every spring, sparks off the locomotives set that strip on fire. And every spring the section men let it burn out against the mowed guard, the way they had for 60 years. By any rule she'd ever been taught, that strip should have been the sorriest grass on the farm. It was the best. Big blue stems stood in it taller than a man on horseback by August, so thick a jackrabbit had to plan his route. Meadowlarks nested in it. Her cows would walk through a quarter-mile of her own pasture to reach it, and stand at the railroad fence like children at a bakery window. Her own pastures, meanwhile, were quietly going wrong. and going wrong slowly enough that a person could pretend not to see it. Dead grass lay matted underfoot, in a gray felt so deep that new blades had to fight their way through it, like a man swimming in a coat. Smooth brome was creeping in from the road ditches, green and eager in April, brown and useless by the middle of July. And on the far slopes, eastern red cedar was moving in the way it always moves, one dark knee-high tree at a time, each one holding its ground and calling for its relatives. She started carrying a pocket notebook, a habit her father would have recognized, because it had been his. Dates. Which pastures the cows favored and when they quit them. How high the blue stem stood on the railroad strip against how high it stood 20 feet away on her side of the fence. 9 inches of difference in June of 1959. 14 inches in June of 1961. She wrote it down and told no one, because she wasn't yet sure what it meant. But a suspicion had been forming in her for years, quiet and patient, the way water forms ice. The winter of 1961 going into 62, she went looking for her father. Otakar Machachik had been dead since February of 1949, but he had left himself behind in a way particular to careful men. In the granary, in a wooden desk with a roll top that stuck, sat his pasture ledgers, one narrow canvas-bound book for every year from 1912 to 1948. Bozena hauled the whole stack to the kitchen table and spent the dark months reading them by the stove, while the wind worked on the storm windows. Most of it was the ordinary arithmetic of grass. Cattle in, cattle out, pounds gained, rain measured in a coffee can nailed to a post. But threaded through the ordinary entries, spring after spring, ran a word she had nearly forgotten belonged to her own family. Burned the East 80 ahead of rain, March 24, 1926. Burned kettle, draw pasture, wind light out of the south, April 2, 1931. Year after year, her father had put fire on that grass as routinely as other men greased a windmill. And the weights he recorded in the fall of the burned years ran heavier. Steers in the burned pastures of 1937 gained 34 pounds more by September than the steers on unburned grass. And he had done the figuring himself in the margin, twice, as if he hadn't believed it the first time. The burning stopped in 1943. She remembered why without needing the ledger to tell her, though the ledger told her anyway in a single flat entry. War now. County council asks no burning, save it for the enemy. Rubber short, men short. Her father was 62 that spring. His hired man was in the Pacific, and a grass fire needed hands he no longer had. He never burned again. He had 5 springs left, and in the ledger of his last one, March of 1948, in pencil gone silver with age, he had written a line in the margin that Bozena read so many times that winter she could see it with her eyes shut. This grass came up under fire. It will lie down without it. A match in April is worth a barn of hay in August. She was 15 years old the last time her father burned a pasture. She had stood on the wagon and watched the flame walk uphill through the cured grass, roaring soft like wind in a stovepipe, and watched the meadowlarks go up ahead of it, and she remembered that nobody had been afraid. Now she was 54, and she sat in her kitchen with his ledgers spread around her like a hand of cards, and she understood that she hadn't discovered anything at all on that railroad strip. She had remembered it. Guesses on a ranch are worth testing. That was her father's arithmetic, too. The trouble began the morning after her first burn, and it did not let up for 2 years. Vendel Prokaska, who ran the section adjoining her on the south, and had known Bozena since they were children reciting together at the Sokol Hall, drove up her lane while the east pasture was still smoking. He stood looking at 400 acres of black ground with his cap in his hand, like a man at a graveside. "You've killed the best grass in the county," he said. "That's hay you'll wish you had come August." She offered him coffee. He didn't take it. At the elevator in Tabor Creek, men who barely knew her weighed in as if they'd been personally robbed. Somebody said it was a shame to see the old Machachek place go down like that. Somebody else said a woman out there alone had no business handling fire, that it took a crew of men to hold a burn in that country, and everybody knew it. And one man, half joking and half not, said the widow had been odd since Corral dropped at the chute, and that somebody who cared about her ought to go out there and take her matches away. That last one made its way back to Bozena through her sister Rosa in town, the way the worst ones always travel, delivered gently and landing hard. It stung deeper than any of the others. She never mentioned it to a living soul. When people worked up the nerve to ask her directly whether she'd thought this through, she said, "Could be I haven't," and went back to work. Around the county, her place picked up a name. Men gave directions by it. "Turn west at the Widow's Scorch," they said, and grinned, and the grin was not kind. Even the government came, politely. The county extension agent, a young man named Gene Tolliver, 2 years out of college, drove out with a folder of pamphlets about brome establishment and tank silage, and stood in her yard explaining that burning was an old country habit the modern operator had moved past, that bare black ground invited erosion, that she was throwing away a season of grazing every time she lit a match. Bozena gave him coffee, listened to the whole presentation on her feet, thanked him for driving out. Then she walked him to his truck, and as he opened the door, she asked him one question. "Why is the railroad strip the best grass in this county, when it's burned every year of my life?" Tolliver looked at the strip and looked at her, and said he'd have to get back to her on that. He drove off. She went back to work. Here is what Bozena knew from her father's books, and what almost nobody in Riha County remembered in 1962, because a generation of wet years, wartime bans, and new brome pastures had buried it. Tallgrass prairie is not really a crop of leaves, it is a crop of roots. Big bluestem and little bluestem drive their roots 8 and 10 feet down into that flinty ground, deeper than any well digger expects, and the green top a cow eats is only the visible 1/10 of the plant. Old dead grass piled up year after year works against those roots. The mat shades the ground and holds it cold, so the deep-rooted natives start late, while shallow-rooted brome hurries up through the thatch, green and early, and gone by July. Fire in April strips the mat off in 20 minutes. The blackened ground drinks sunlight and warms 2 weeks early. The natives wake up strong into clean light, and every seedling cedar on the hill dies in one afternoon. Her father hadn't invented that. The prairie and the Kaw and Osage before him had run on it for 10,000 years. The county had simply forgotten, and forgetting had a smell, and the smell was cedar. Nobody in town saw the work that came before the match, which was most of the work. Through the whole month of March 1962, Bozena mowed firebreaks around the east pasture with Carell's old tractor, and a sickle bar that threw a shear pin every third round, 12 feet of clipped stubble on the downwind sides, doubled where the ground rose. She raked the clippings off by hand where the mower left them thick, because her father's 1926 ledger said a guard with hay on it is a fuse, not a fence. She patched the sprayer to carry water on the flatbed, filled 2 cream cans besides, and hung wet gunny sacks on the stock racks the way she remembered the hired man doing when she was a girl. In the evenings, she stood in the yard and watched which way the smoke off her own chimney leaned, and wrote it down. The night before, she walked the east pasture one last time in the dark. Cured bluestem stood hip-high all around her, pale as oat straw under a quarter moon, so dry it whispered against her coat with a sound like paper asking a question. She stood still in the middle of it for a long minute, one hand on a bluestem stalk, listening to a great horned owl work the draw. 15 years old, she had watched this same grass burn and had not been afraid. She decided she was not going to start now. That first burn, the April morning with the fire trucks idling at her fence, had actually gone well. 44 acres, a light north wind, flame walking uphill slow and downwind not at all, out by noon against the mowed guards, the whole black square smoking gently like a field-sized griddle. What went badly was everything after. The talk, the name, the sideways looks at the Sokol Hall suppers, where she had cooked kolaches beside these families for 30 years. The second burn was the one that nearly finished her. April 9th, 1963. She had planned it for a week, watched the sky like a sailor, cut her guards wider than her father's ledger called for. She lit the east line at 9:30, with the breeze steady out of the northwest, exactly as forecast. At a few minutes past 11, the wind swung hard to the north and picked up, the way spring wind in Kansas swings, without apology. The flame jumped her southern guard at a low place, where the mower had ridden up over a flint ledge and left the grass standing. And in 20 minutes it ran 300 yards down Vendel Prokaska's fence line, burning off 38 hedge posts and a winter's worth of his stacked cedar staves before it died in his disked firebreak. No animal was hurt. No building was touched. It didn't matter. A fire that leaves your own ground has a different name, and everyone in the county learned it by Sunday. Bozena drove to the Prokaska place that same evening with her checkbook in her coat pocket and found Vendel standing at his burned fence in the last light. She said she would pay for the posts, the staves, and the man hours to reset everyone. Vendel looked at the black line running across his pasture for a long time. Then he said the sentence that she would hear again, later, in a very different room. "Bozena," he said, "I don't want your check. I want your matches." 2 weeks later, a petition with 29 signatures went to the county commissioners asking for an ordinance against open-range burning in Riha County. And a hearing was set for the second Tuesday in May at the courthouse at 7 in the evening, in the same second-floor room where wheat prices and bridge repairs usually did their quiet business. Radek drove out on the Sunday before it and sat at his mother's kitchen table, turning his cap in his hands the way Vendel had turned his at the graveside of her east pasture. "Mama," he said, "I love you. Pay for the posts, let the burning go, and this is all forgotten by threshing time. Nobody out here thinks less of you for quitting a thing that doesn't work." Bozena almost agreed with him. Sitting in that kitchen with the petition in the newspaper, the repair bill on the spindle, her son's steady, worried face across the oilcloth, and the whole county convinced the widow had finally cracked. Quitting would have been as easy as nodding. She didn't nod. That night, after Radek's taillights turned onto the county road, she took down her father's last ledger and read the pencil line one more time, the way another woman might have read a psalm. "This grass came up under fire. It will lie down without it." Then she went to bed, and in the morning she fed her cows. And on the second Tuesday in May, she put on her funeral dress, took the 1937 ledger and her own pocket notebook, and drove herself to the courthouse in town. She did not know that a stranger would be sitting in the back row of that hearing room. A heavy-set old man in a gray suit, nobody recognized, 71 years old, retired 8 years from the state grassland experiment station, who had read about the widow's scorch in the Tabor Creek paper his niece mailed him every week, and had driven 90-odd miles to see for himself whether somebody in Riha County had finally remembered what grass was for. His name was Bohumil Hovorka, and what he stood up and said that evening would split the county in half. The hearing room on the second floor of the Riha County Courthouse held 40 folding chairs, and on the evening of May 14, 1963, it needed twice that. Men stood along both walls with their hats in their hands. The windows were open to the spring dark, and moths worked the ceiling fixtures. And the county clerk read the petition out loud in the flat voice reserved for documents that have already made everybody angry. Vendel Prokaska spoke first, and to his credit he did not perform. He said his fence line was burned, and his cedar staves were gone, that he'd known Bozena Svejda since they were children reciting verses at the Sokol Hall, that he had nothing against her and everything against fire, which did not care whose land it was on. "A grass fire in this country is a horse with no bridle," he said. "I don't care how good the rider is." Men along the walls nodded. Lars Bielek, the fire chief, said his department ran on 11 volunteers and 2 trucks older than most of the marriages in the room, and that every burn was a gamble with his men's Saturdays and possibly their lives. More nodding. Then Bozena stood up in her funeral dress, and the room got the kind of quiet that has weight. She did not apologize and she did not argue. She opened her father's 1937 ledger and read the fall weights, burned pasture against unburned, in Otakar Machacek's own figures. She opened her pocket notebook and read her measurements off the railroad strip, June against June, year against year, the strip that had burned every spring for 60 years and stood 14 inches taller than her own grass 20 feet away. Then she looked at the commissioners and said the only sentence of her own she had prepared. "Every man in this room has been feeding cedar trees and calling it pasture. I made one mistake on one guard, and I have paid Vendel Prokaska for every post. But the fire is not the mistake. The fire is the correction. She sat down, and in the silence that followed, a heavy-set stranger in a gray suit rose from the back row and said his name was Bohumil Hovorka, retired these 8 years from the state grassland experiment station, and asked the commissioner's patience for 5 minutes. He got 20. He told the room what the widow's ledgers had been telling her all winter, except with 30 years of station plots behind it, that everything they grazed sat on tall grass prairie, and tall grass prairie was not a gift of the rain, but a child of fire, burned by lightning and by the tribes for thousands of years before the first Bohemian ever laid a fence line on it, that the grass they were so proud of was mostly root, sunk 8 and 10 feet into the flint, and the roots were starving in the shade of their own dead leaves, that the cedars filling their draws were not an act of God, but an act of neglect, because no cedar under 4 feet survives a good April fire, and every pasture in the county was wearing 20 years of skipped Aprils. Then he said the sentence that split the county in half and kept the so-called hall arguing until threshing. You can pass an ordinance against fire, he said. You cannot repeal it. All you will choose tonight is which fire you get. Hers in April, behind a mowed guard, with the trucks notified. Or the other one, in August, with a lightning bolt and a south wind and 20 years of fuel standing in cedar. This country will burn. The only question on your table is whether it burns on purpose. The commissioners voted 2-1 against the ordinance. What they passed instead, scratched out that same night with Bilek grumbling at their elbow, were rules. Notice to the fire department a full day ahead. No burning with wind above 15 miles an hour or humidity below 30%. Neighbors informed in writing. Bozena voted for the rules herself, in the only way that counted, by following every one of them to the letter for the rest of her life. Hovorka drove out to her place the next morning, and that was the beginning of the second inheritance. He was 71, wheezed on hills, and read grass the way a banker reads a note. He knelt at the railroad fence for a long time, parting the new blue stem shoots with 2 fingers. And then he knelt on her side of the fence in the felted gray thatch and did the same. Ma'am, he said finally, your father was running one of the better grazing operations in the state, and I'd wager not 50 men alive remember it. You've got his books. I've got the stations. Between the two, we might make this county remember what it's standing on. He came back once a month after that, rode her pastures in a borrowed pickup, taught her to read what she'd only been noticing. Where the old man's ledgers said when, Hovorka could say why, and between when and why a person can build something that lasts. He also taught her the arithmetic that would carry the whole gamble, the particular economics that had built every big stone barn in the Flint Hills. That country was stocker country and always had been, because the flint ledges that broke a plowman's heart had saved the grass from the plow. Every spring since the rail lines came, thin southern steers had ridden north to spend April to September getting fat on blue stem, and the men who owned the grass got paid for the pounds the grass put on. Burned pasture greens up 2 weeks early and comes in clean, leafy, and rich in protein, and a steer on fresh, burned blue stem will outgain a steer on thatchy, unburned ground from the first week of May. Gain was the whole crop. The scale at the sale barn was the harvest, and a scale, as Hovorka liked to say, has no opinion about widows. In 1964, she burned 1/3 of the ranch under the new rules, with Bilek's trucks standing by unneeded and half the township parked along the road to watch. In 1965, she burned another 1/3, and that summer the east pasture came back in a way that made passing drivers slow down for a different reason. Big bluestem stood thigh-high by the 4th of July, where brome had been quitting for years. The turkeyfoot seed heads purple bronze in the evening light. The little cedars on the burned slopes stood dead and rust-colored, like nails driven into the hill and forgotten. Prairie chickens came back to a booming ground on the ridge that her father's 1929 ledger mentioned, and she had never once seen used. That spring she took in 52 custom steers from a Texas order buyer at a nickel a pound of gain, weighed them on and weighed them off, and mailed the owner a set of figures he wired back about, asking whether the scale was broken. It was Hovorka, in the fall of 1965, who gave her the warning she later called the cheapest gift she ever got. They were standing at the corrals watching the steers load out, and he nodded at the neighboring ridges, brome green and cedar specked, and said, "Brome is a bank that pays in wet years, and we have had a run of wet years. Country like this, drought is never if. When it comes, the difference between 8 feet of root and 8 inches is going to stand at the sale barn scale for everybody to read." Bozena wrote it in her notebook that night, word for word. She had learned what her father's ledgers were for. The dry year came in 1966, and it did not knock first. The spring rains quit the 3rd week of May and simply did not resume. 63 days passed, without measurable rain in a coffee can that had measured every rain on that place since 1912. The ponds shrank to gray saucers with a rim of cracked mud, and the brome pastures of Riha County, so green in April, went brown and brittle by the middle of June, cured on the stem 2 months ahead of schedule with the feed value of binder twine. Shallow roots had nothing left to drink. Hay that had sold for $13 a ton this summer before brought $26 by August, when a man could find it. All over the county, ranchers began hauling water, feeding winter hay in July, and shipping cattle early, thin, into a falling market crowded with everyone else's early, thin cattle. Bozena hauled no water and fed no hay. Her burn pastures cured too eventually, because everything cures. But her blue stem had wakened early on the blackened ground, rooted 8 feet down where the subsoil still held the banked moisture of springs gone by. And it grew green and stayed green weeks after the brome quit, and even cured it carried protein the brome had never had. Her 106 custom steers, the biggest set she had ever dared take, grazed through the worst summer in a decade with their heads down and their backs level. Neighbors driving past could see it from the road, the same road they had once driven slow to watch a fire, and now drove slow to watch fat cattle standing in a drought like a rumor nobody could confirm. The sale barn scale confirmed it on October 14, 1966. The steers came off her grass after 118 days and crossed the scale at the Riha County sale barn with half the coffee shop watching, because word had gone ahead, the way it does. Stanley Cermak read the weights out loud and worked the average twice on the back of a ticket. 197 pounds of gain ahead, drought and all. No other set of yearlings weighed in that fall within 90 pounds of it. And most of the county's cow herds had lost weight where her steers had gained it. The Texas order buyer was standing at the rail. He asked her, in front of everybody, what she wanted for a 3-year handshake on that grass. Nobody laughed. Somewhere in the crowd a man said, quietly, not quietly enough, "That's the widow's scorch." And for the first time the name came out sounding like an address a man would be glad to give. Vendel Prokaska came to her gate 11 days later, in the first cold rain of the fall, which had arrived the way rain does, too late to matter and too welcome to curse. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, and Bozena came out on the porch, and for a moment neither of them said anything while the rain worked on the shingles. Then Vendel cleared his throat. "I come about the matches," he said. It took her a second. Then she saw it. The hearing room handed back to her 3 years later, turned upside down and offered as an apology, because that was the only shape of apology a man like Vendel had on hand. "My south section," he said. "Cedars got into it so bad I can't find my own cows in November. I was hoping you'd walk it with me. Show me where a guard ought to go." She walked it with him for 2 afternoons, free of charge, the same way she answered everyone who came after him. And by the next spring there were many. She pointed out what her father's ledgers and Hovorka's plots had taught her to see, where the Flint ledge would carry standing grass over a mowed line if a man wasn't careful, which draw would funnel wind, how to read the morning smoke off a chimney, and why a guard with hay on it is a fuse. When people asked her, and they all eventually asked her, how she had known this would work, she gave them the same 8 words, and never one more. "It's my father's fire. I just carry the can." In April of 1967, on a still gray morning with the humidity right, 11 crews burned along the Tabor Creek Road under Bilek's rules, neighbors holding each other's guards, trucks moving from place to place like threshing season run in reverse. Vendel's south section went black at 10 in the morning and came up emerald by the 1st of May, and the dead cedars stood rusting on the slopes for years afterward, like a lesson nobody needed repeated. Gene Tolliver, the extension agent, drove out that summer with a mimeographed bulletin from the state college on prescribed range burning, and handed it to Bozena a little sheepishly, and finally answered the question she had asked him in her driveway 5 years before. "Because it burns," he said. "That's the whole answer, isn't it?" "It always was," she said, and asked him in for coffee, and this time he took it. By the spring of 1968, 6 years after 2 fire trucks rolled for a widow with a syrup can torch, better than 8,000 acres of Riha County went black on purpose every April, and greened up in a way that men had begun bragging about at the elevator, as if the idea had been theirs all along. Bozena let them brag. Hovorka, 83 now and still wheezing up hills, rode a lawn chair in her yard on burn mornings and graded everyone's smoke. Radek had come all the way around, the way sons sometimes do, quietly and without ceremony, and he managed the guard mowing every march with a level of caution his mother found extremely satisfying. And on a cool April morning in 1968, Bozena Svejda, 61 years old, stood at the wagon in her east pasture and lifted her grandson Tomas up onto the boards, so the boy could see over the smoke. The flame walked uphill through the cured grass, roaring soft like wind in a stovepipe, and the meadowlarks went up ahead of it, and the boy watched with his mouth open, and nobody was afraid. Bozena stood with one hand on the wagon and watched him watch it. 15 years old, she had stood on these same boards. It had taken her 39 years and the whole county's laughter to climb back up. She never told it as a story about being right. She told it as a story about remembering. The land had been saying one thing for 10,000 years, in a voice as plain as a railroad strip that would not stop outgrowing everything around it. And a county full of good men had talked themselves out of hearing it in a single generation. It took somebody with an old ledger, a widow's stubbornness, and nothing much left to lose to strike a match and listen. I think about Bozena when people tell me some piece of old knowledge is out of date. Sometimes it is, but sometimes what we call progress is just forgetting with its shirt tucked in. And the ones who keep the old fires, the unfashionable, laughed at, careful ones, are holding something the rest of us will come asking for when the dry year finds us. It usually does. And when it comes, you learn fast whose roots go 8 feet down and whose quit at the surface. This story is true to life fiction, inspired by the kind of stories America remembers. All characters, names, places, and businesses are creative inventions, and any resemblance to actual persons or events is coincidental.